Good evening and welcome to the first virtual edition of the biannual Sardis lecture. I'm Susanne Ebbinghaus. I'm the George M.A. Hanfmann Curator of Ancient Art and also the head of the Division of Asian and Mediterranean Art at the Harvard Art Museums, and I will serve as the moderator this evening. Before we begin, we would like to pay tribute to the original inhabitants of the land that Harvard resides on by acknowledging that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people. We strive to honor this relationship. Thank you for joining us this evening. The virtual format has the advantage that in addition to the greater Boston and New York City audiences, these are the places where the biannual lecture usually takes place. Sardis friends from all around the United States can join us. I think there are some night owls joining us from Turkey too, but as you can see, the lecture is also being recorded and it will be available online eventually. Some logistics. We are using the webinar format in Zoom, which means that your cameras are off and your microphones are muted. Closed captioning is available, and it can be turned on by clicking the closed captioning button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You can use the Q&A box to ask questions. Again, that's located at the bottom of your screen, and you can do so throughout the program. We'll leave time at the end of the presentation to address questions, but since we have a very, very large group tonight, we may not get to all of them. We will follow up with you by email to share links and resources discussed during the lecture. At the biannual lecture, the expedition director traditionally reports on the results of 2 field seasons. Could I have the next slide? Reports on the results of 2 field seasons, and this is indeed the case this year, since a small field season did take place in summer of 2020. This means that there has been a field season every year since 1958, when George Hanfmann resumed excavations at Sardis. And in summer could you go back one slide? And in summer, I think there must be a lag in the program. And in summer 2020, there were also Harvard students working virtually from the United States. And this year also, the expedition can report on other results in both tangible and virtual format, namely 2 heavyweight publications that some of you may already have seen. Most of the team members who were on site last summer are based in Turkey. In fact, the collaboration with Turkish colleagues and the involvement of Turkish students has characterized the Sardis expedition from the very beginnings. And those of you who watched Sardis's contributions to Harvard's Worldwide Week last October have heard from some of our Turkish colleagues and have heard them talk about their work at Sardis. And next slide. Among the many Harvard Sardis traditions that have continued through the decades, the directors are excellent speakers and teachers. As you can see in this image, Hanfmann clearly had no problem making his audience erupt with laughter, and I have very vivid memories of Crawford Greeny's Sardis lectures at Harvard, including one with a musical interlude. So before I steal any more of his time, let me introduce our speaker this evening, Nicholas Cahill. And the next slide, please. Nicholas Cahill holds the Simona and Jerome Chazen Distinguished Chair in Art History at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where he is also an affiliate professor in classics. He received his BA from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and an MA and a PhD in ancient history and Mediterranean archaeology from the University of California at Berkeley. His dissertation, which he published as a book, examined household and city organization in Olympus in northern Greece. And in fact, here is another parallel with Hanfmann, who wrote his second dissertation on metalwork from Olympus. Nicholas Cahill has edited and co-authored books on Sardis, including Love for Lydia, the volume honoring Crawford Greenwald, and also the Lydians and Their World catalog. He has also written numerous articles and contributions to collective volumes and overseen the publication of an impressive number of Sardis reports, monographs, and studies volumes. He's also successfully raised funding for several projects at Sardis. As a field director, he somehow manages to be everywhere at once. And as you could see from the drone video on the first slide and also this snapshot here, he is a consummate drone pilot. So welcome, Nick.
Well, thank you, Susanna. Research at Sardis has been conducted, as Susanna says, every year since 1958 by a team sponsored by Harvard and Cornell universities. And you see the 2019 and the smaller 2020 teams here. When the pandemic hit a year ago, we were in pretty good shape, actually, to continue research and publication from home, including a virtual season with students who found themselves unexpectedly locked up in their apartments. And we even managed to conduct a short season of site conservation and study in Turkey. So I wanted to start by thanking the many people who have made this research and this evening's lecture possible. Martha Tedeschi, the director of the Harvard Art Museums, the Faculty Oversight Committee at Harvard and its director, Adrian Staley, which provides support and advice at Harvard, and Alyssa Martinez at the Harvard Art Museums. Permission to work at the site in Turkey is granted each year by the Ministry of Culture and Tourism of the Republic of Turkey, and we're very grateful for their continual support and also for the generosity and support of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Turkish Consulate General in Boston for all their assistance with permits and visas each and every year. Sardis was one of the great cities of the ancient world, famous as the place where coinage was invented, the motherland of the Etruscans in Italy, according to some ancient authors, and one of the 7 churches of Asia. It's located at the edge of the Hermus River Valley, about an hour's drive from Izmir, in the foothills of the Tmolus Mountains. It's a site of great natural beauty with the cliffs of the Acropolis gleaming golden in the morning light, rising above fertile green plains. In antiquity, Sardis was prized for its many natural resources, its fertility, its forests, other resources in the mountains, its impregnable citadel, and the Pactolus River, burbled by the site, and above all else brought Sardis fame because it ran rich with alluvial gold, making the inhabitants, the Lydians, the wealthiest people in the world and the inventors of the first coins. The gold ran out, but Sardis's fame as a golden city was never lost. So let me give a brief history focusing on some of the particular problems that occupy our research these days. First, who were the Lydians? In about 668 BC, Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria in Iraq, the most powerful man in the world, received an emissary at his capital at Nineveh. The stranger spoke a language nobody could understand, but explained that he came from Lydia, and they were being threatened by nomadic horsemen from Central Asia called the Cimmerians. The Lydian king, Gyges, offered submission to the Assyrian king if he would help repel the invaders. In the end, the diplomacy led nowhere. The Assyrians sent no aid, and the Cimmerians eventually swept through the land, sacked Sardis, and killed Gyges. But at just about this time, one of the earliest Greek poets, Archilochus, boasted that he did not care for the wealth of Gyges, rich in gold. This is a common conceit among the Greeks who claimed to be above mere lucre and to value friendship over coin. Gyges, however, did dedicate at the Greek sanctuary of Delphi 6 mixing bowls weighing maybe 780 kilograms of gold. But these 2 earliest literary sources illustrate the position of Lydia between East and West. To the Assyrians, the Lydians were a distant people beyond the Western limits of civilization, speaking an incomprehensible language, not worth sending an army all that way to support. To the Greeks, on the other hand, the Lydians were the prototypical Oriental monarchs, living in unimaginable luxury, famous for delicately woven headbands and exotic foods and an irresistible cavalry. They also stand at the border between history and prehistory. The Greek geographer Strabo tells us that Sardis did not exist until after the Trojan War, about 1200 BC. And for the period between, say, 1200 and Gyges in about 680, say, we have only fabulous stories like how Queen Omphale enslaved Heracles and made him wear women's clothes while she wore his lion skin and club. It's a wonderful reversal of gender roles and encapsulates the Greeks' attitudes towards Lydians as, on the one hand, barbaric and effeminate, and on the other hand, powerful enough to overcome the Greeks. But it's probably not history. When Sardis first appears in history in the 7th century, the Greek city-state was just developing, and we've concluded then that the Lydians developed more or less in step with the Greeks. It's worth remembering, though, that the Assyrians and other Near Eastern cultures had been urbanized for centuries already. Can archaeology help understand how Sardis first became a city and how the Lydian state developed? This was one of the questions that occupied Professor George Honfman of Harvard when he founded the excavation in 1958. One of the first trenches that Honfman dug that year was in a sector called House of Bronzes, and the discovery of the first Lydian occupation remains was the occasion for tremendous excitement. Over the next 15 years, Honfman dug up small houses of the 6th century BC. Beneath those, and so earlier, he found rather larger but still simple buildings of the 7th century, about the time of Gyges and Ashurbanipal and Archilochus. Lower still, he found a destruction level of the 8th century BC, long before our historical records, with casualties whom we'll meet later, and a great deal of very nice pottery and other artifacts. Professor Honfman dug deeper still, finding the earliest levels dating to the end of the late Bronze Age, about 1200 BC, which accords pretty well with Strabo's account that Sardis was founded just after the Trojan War. The remains were only a hut and a burial, no signs of a great city, and quite in keeping with a contemporary simple Greek settlement, not like huge cities of the Assyrians. The publication of this sector has been the long-term project of Andrew and Nancy Ramage and Gul Gertic and Demir, and I'll return to our publication program later. When Professor Honfman excavated Hob, though, he thought that this was the center of the Lydian city and thought of it as kind of a market or bazaar. Excavations in the 80s and 90s, topic for another talk though, proved that the center of Lydian Sardis lay to the east and that Hob was outside the city walls. This, of course, changed our understanding of Hob, and we've now turned our attention to the center of Lydian Sardis, and particularly to a hill called Field 49, which we believe was part of the Lydian palace. Well, to return to history for a moment, in 547 BC, a new king, Cyrus, was on the rise in Persia. Hoping to add territory to his empire, Croesus, then the king of Sardis, asked the oracle at Delphi whether he should attack Cyrus. And the oracle famously and ambiguously replied that if he did, he would destroy a great empire. So Croesus set out, but was defeated by the Persian king, and so fulfilled the oracle by destroying his own empire. We've uncovered dramatic remains of the sack of Sardis. Houses were burned, soldiers slaughtered and left unburied in the rubble, the fortification demolished. These destructive events are bad for the people, but great for archaeologists since they preserve so many artifacts and other things. We get this detailed look at the lives of ordinary people, interrupted so suddenly that we find cooking pots on hearths still filled with grain. But what happened next when the Lydians were no longer masters of their world, but part of a larger empire? We've always assumed that Sardis continued as it did before, but just under new management. But the archaeological record tells a different story. It turns out that the city center was almost entirely abandoned. Here, for instance, you see a Lydian house in purple destroyed by Cyrus in 547 BC. The next major activity on this spot was more than 350 years later when the Hellenistic theater was built. In the intervening centuries, although this was a major regional satrapal capital with a powerful governor and a strong garrison under the Persians, the ancient walled city seems to have laid fallow in blue. Understanding this process of de-urbanization is another goal of recent work. Alexander the Great took Sardis in 334 BC, and its transformation from a Persian capital to a Greek polis was the subject of a special study led by Andrea Berlin and Paul Kosman, culminating in the publication in 2019 of Sphere 1 Land. The greatest monument of this period is the Temple of Artemis, which was the subject of another research project lasting more than 30 years. Fikret Yegul drew every marble block of the temple and wrote a detailed account of this magnificent building. And after these decades of research and writing, his 2-volume report was finally published last summer. Sardis joined the Roman Empire in 133 BC, but the profound change in the city comes a century and a half later. It was located in a fertile, defensible spot, but the site has disadvantages, such as being located directly on a major fault line. In 17 AD, a devastating earthquake struck the city, but the Sardians rebuilt the place with the help of the imperial purse. Among the public projects were the stadium, the reconstruction of the theater, and particularly a sanctuary of the imperial cult exactly in the city center with a huge temple, lavishly decorated with relief and freestanding sculpture and ornament. Again, more later. Later in the Roman era, the temple was dismantled and its remains were built into new buildings on the spot, one of many cases where the Sardians recycled their own past. And this is another of our major research interests, the later days of the city when the world was undergoing dramatic changes from the pagan world of imperial Rome to the Christian world of Byzantium. These houses are well preserved for us, ironically, because they were destroyed in another massive earthquake in the early 7th century AD. Roofs and walls collapsed, leaving at least one inhabitant crushed. Buildings around the site tumbled like dominoes. After the earthquake, there's no sign of major rebuilding. After thriving for 1,000 years, Sardis was no longer a city. The site remained important, though, and in the early Byzantine period, the inhabitants fortified the Acropolis, hauling blocks from the wrecked ancient buildings up the steep slope to build these new tremendous fortifications. And we are beginning a new project to understand Sardis and the Acropolis in this post-antique period. So let me start with some of our work on the Lydian period on Field 49. One of the most striking features of Lydian urbanism is the way they enclosed natural hills of the Acropolis with monumental terrace walls built of giant boulders or gleaming white limestone masonry, which regularized and organized and separated this region from the lower city. This radical transformation of the natural landscape is quite unlike contemporary Greek urbanism. And when these terraces were discovered in the 1980s, we believed that they were outside, as I told you, the Lydian city. When we learned later on that this was actually the city center, these terrace walls were clues that this region was part of the palatial quarter. So Guzine Eren of Boston University has bravely dug on the steep and windy north slope for more than 8 seasons. She's exposed a terrace wall made of huge boulders for a length of 135 feet, the most conspicuous monument of Lydian architecture at the city site. Part of her work has been to understand the date of this wall. Pottery from some of it dates to the 6th century BC, rather late in the Lydian period. But pottery from other parts seems to date much earlier in the 8th century, when we thought that Sardis was only a village. In her dissertation, she argues that this is an early 8th century wall, which was largely rebuilt using the same stones, again, this confusing recycling of earlier remains, but pushing the history of monumental construction at Sardis well before anything that we'd realized before. Down the slope of the hill, she's distinguished at least 2 more major phases of terracing. One, a huge wall, 16 feet thick with a beautiful white limestone face, a big deal bringing all this stone from the quarries 7 miles away at Bintepe. This was further expanded with a sandstone-faced section, and her careful excavations found evidence dating this last phase to the late 7th or early 6th century BC, the period of Sardis's greatest expansion. When she followed the wall westward, though, she found that it had been almost entirely robbed out after the Persian capture of Sardis in 547 BC. And this adds further weight to that observation that the city center lay abandoned for the Persian period, quarried for stone and for valuables, and was only reoccupied then after Alexander's conquest. Moving further west, in 2019, we set out to find a corner of this terrace by opening a new trench on the steep corner of the hill. Hakan Aycan of Ege University in Izmir and Rebecca Deitch of Harvard uncovered an absolute maze of Roman walls, some of which were built from limestone blocks from earlier Lydian buildings, Other walls were finely plastered. These were probably terrace houses built along the slopes, and Rebecca distinguished three major phases of Roman occupation. We had, of course, intended to return in 2020, but were unable to do so. However, another major objective was to understand the Lydian buildings on top of this terrace wall. Zoom up ahead a little bit there. Unfortunately, like on top of the terrace, like most terraces, most of the later Lydian buildings, the Palace of Croesus, have been entirely robbed out to reuse their blocks in later structures. But in 2013, at the bottom of the trench, more than 23 feet deep, Eugene found a thick mud brick wall with gaps for big wooden posts. In 2019, she located the corner of this building and so could reconstruct the building as a square about 16 by 16 feet. Its thick walls and post holes suggest a tall and substantial structure, much more than an ordinary house, some kind of an elite building. Pottery from the building is very sparse and plain and hard to date, but generally similar to the early levels of Hob of the 8th or the 9th century BC. And a carbon-14 sample gave a date of 996 to 837 BC, strikingly early, a couple centuries earlier than Gyges and Ashurbanipal, in that mythological period of Sardis's history. It is, in fact, our earliest monumental architecture at Sardis. Remember that at Hob, in this period, there's only the scrappiest architecture. In contrast, the city center is already monumental. In order to try to date this and other early buildings, in 2019, we tried a new method, optically stimulated luminescence, which can measure how long it's been since a bit of dirt has been exposed to the sunlight. Since the technique measures time since sediments have seen light, the samples have to be taken at night, so the team went out in the middle of the night to collect the samples. And despite the pandemic, Joel Spencer of the University of Kansas analyzed Eugene's samples and found dates of between 4,000 and 11,000 BC, impossibly early, far older than any possible date of the building. Apparently, the sediments had not been exposed to light the way they should have been when they were last deposited, which disappointed and surprised all of us. But we are nonetheless learning a great deal about the very earliest Lydians here on the hill and finding that Sardis was a different place from what we believed, surprisingly monumental and quite unlike contemporary Greek settlements. We learn more about even earlier Sardians, however, in the next trench to the south. This was meant to uncover the western terrace wall and buildings associated with it, and they are indeed there. But reaching those levels has taken many years of painstaking work. This hill, again, was prime real estate for most of Sardis's long history, and Will Bruce has uncovered layer after layer of interesting and important buildings. After that long Persian gap, for instance, the Hellenistic builders returned to the hill and built massive structures out of reused Lydian limestone blocks, like this platform or terrace wall, and a huge foundation built of limestone blocks weighing up to a ton. These extraordinary structures suggest that in the Hellenistic period, when Sardis became the western capital of the Seleucid kingdom, this hill may have been converted back into a palace quarter. The Hellenistic wall had cut through an earlier garbage pit filled with bones and pottery, and also an assortment of exotic materials, ivory and bone inlays, scales from a suit of iron lamellar armor, and perhaps 27 arrowheads. Pottery and a tiny silver coin show that the pit was dug in the Persian period in the early 5th century BC, in that mysterious blank period when the site was abandoned, the city part was abandoned. But the luxury objects, like ivory and arrowheads and so forth, probably date to the Lydian period and are detritus from the palace, discarded here by the Persians who were quarrying the hill for reusable stone and valuables. But this is one of our very few Persian conquests contexts, and everything we can learn from it is important. So Harvard interns Mid Sheftel and Hui Su studied the mountains of pottery from this pit to find joins, adding important new shapes to this little known period. Now in 2017, Julia Judge had uncovered a small stretch of beautiful limestone masonry, the kind found in elite Lydian buildings elsewhere and just what the palace should be made of. Just as exciting was a small area of burned floor dating to the middle of the 6th century with 3 arrowheads on it, maybe the remains of the Persian sack of Sardis in 547. And again, these destruction levels often produce really important collections of restorable and closely dated objects. And this seems to be one of the few unplundered areas on the hill. So that was 2017. We spent the next couple of years carefully excavating and recording and dismantling, again, a maze of Roman and Hellenistic strata. And by the end of 2019, we were within spitting distance of the Lydian floor and wall, but the season was coming to an end. So we had to make do with delayed gratification until 2020. And then, of course, we got the pandemic. So Croesus' palace and the Persian destruction and all of its surprises are there still waiting for us. Another surprise of the last few years of work here was the discovery of even earlier remains than cuisines. To investigate Lydian terracing, Will dug deep sondages into the terrace fill, 16 feet of clean sand and gravel, but underneath, dating to the 6th century BC. Underneath that terrace fill, he found occupation levels of the late Bronze Age, with these nose pots and other characteristic shapes of the 2nd millennium BC. You remember the Greek authors believed that Sardis was founded only at the end of the late Bronze Age, but this shows that the hill was occupied much earlier. The intrepid Will Bruce continued to excavate, and under the late Bronze Age levels found another 4 or 5 meters of almost sterile gravel sloping down steeply to the west. That is, he found an earlier terrace fill, showing that the hill had already been terraced in the Bronze Age. And eventually, 46 feet below the surface, the height of a 5-story building, he reached bedrock, again steeply sloping down to the west. Peter Pavuk and Fulya Dedeoğlu studied the ceramics from these terrace fills, and concluded that the terrace dates to the early Bronze Age 3B period, about 2000 BC. And in 2019, this was confirmed by a radiocarbon date from the lowest level, giving a date of 2346 to 2140 BC. So this tiny telephone booth has pushed the history of Sardis back more than 1,000 years. But in addition, it changed how we understand the natural landscape. Geologists had told us that this was an originally flat-topped hill, a very convenient place to settle. We now find that the hill sloped very steeply, and to make it habitable would have required big terraces, and this was first done more than 1,000 years before the Lydian period. So to learn more about these early terraces is going to be a challenge. It takes a long time to get to Lydian levels. Another 1,000 years is going to be more difficult. A geophysical team from the 9th of September University in Izmir has helped us understand the situation. Geophysical prospection, surveying remains still buried under the earth, has a long history at Sardis since 1962, but is beset by the same problems that make archaeology in general so difficult. The site is complex and very deeply buried. So they've used a whole variety of methods: electrical resistivity, magnetometry, ground penetrating radar, but these don't see more than 3 or 4 meters deep. So in 2019, they used different methods: electrical resistance tomography and induced polarization tomography, seismic refraction tomography, and multi-channel analysis of surface waves, which can give sections up to 8 meters deep. And this gives us a sense, I hope, of how much the hill has been modified in antiquity. This colorful image shows a section following this red line, and shows that there is lots of archaeology on the sides of the hill, the west side in reds and browns where we've been digging, not very much. Blue indicating bedrock in the center, and then more to the east as we move down the hill. This fits with a hill that's been greatly enlarged by human intervention. Of course, it doesn't give a date. For that, we have to dig. And other techniques, especially ground penetrating radar, can give us a more intuitive sort of map of features at different depths, although they don't penetrate so deeply. Along the west side of the hill, their survey picked up a fairly clear and deep building, a massive feature. And here you see sort of little sections at 10 to 19 centimeters, 29 to 39. And you can, as you go down, you can see walls sort of begin to coalesce in the radar. You can see now the beginning of a wall going north-south there. And as we go deeper, we're at 2 meters, 6 feet deep now. We see another small sort of L-shaped building beginning to appear. Now we're at 3 meters, and it's becoming more and more clear. And it actually goes down to well over 3 meters. So we set a trench there to try to figure out what this was. It uncovered buildings seen in the geophysics, which was satisfying, but their date was completely unexpected. Instead of Roman or Hellenistic or Lydian, which we always find, some of these walls are medieval, dating to the 15th or 16th century AD. This is almost as much of a surprise as the early Bronze Age was. We knew that there were people at Sardis at this time, but they were supposed to be down by the Pactolus River, not up here in the hills. We've not yet reached the depths of the monumental building shown on the radar, and it's likely that these late walls were built directly on earlier structures, so we hope to dig further here. But it is typical that we have Sardis's oldest and some of its most recent remains right next door to one another and at about the same elevation. A final project on this hill has been to try to learn more about its southern end. A trench was dug here in 2009 to 2013. And in those years, we found this really interesting Roman building with an oven and painted walls. Although the stones of the walls had been completely removed to reuse them, the plaster survived in fragments and could be reconstructed in watercolors. There were also massive Hellenistic foundations and 2 phases of Lydian terracing, which we found elsewhere, dating to the 6th and the 8th century BC, we think. But we also found here an area of burned Lydian destruction debris, churned up and disturbed, but containing the bones of 2 human casualties, a bit of ivory furniture, bronze dishes, and big clumps of iron arrowheads. This is apparently debris from the Persian sack of the palace here, for the material looks very different from our usual domestic destruction debris. Ordinary people don't have ivory furniture or bronze dishes or fancy jasper seals. The destruction debris continued to the south, and so we expanded and were fortunate to have Susanna Ebbinghaus to take on this trench in 2019. And the most difficult archaeology really is this chewed up stuff. It's easy enough to uncover a well-preserved building that's just sitting under the dirt, but Susanna had to deal with those walls whose stones had been removed, leaving only bits of wall plaster to indicate where they'd once been, and then there were late Roman pits and so forth. As you can see, we've only just begun here, and as you've seen, it does take time to get these results. So we look forward to continuing this into earlier levels. So our excavations on Field 49 have contributed to our understanding of the earliest periods of Sardis, as well as the latest. This hill was densely occupied in the Roman era, but as we've seen, the remains from that period are not very well preserved. But a lower terrace offers important insights into Roman Sardis. In 1981, we had discovered the corner of a temple called the Wadi B Temple and concluded that it was a temple of the Roman imperial cult. We returned to this area to put this temple in its larger urban context. We found out that the temple did not stand on its own, but was part of a great sanctuary terrace, part of the replanning of the city after the earthquake of 17 AD. However, the temple, one of Sardis's most important sanctuaries, had been deliberately dismantled and its fragments reused in a late Roman construction on the east side of the terrace. We found, for instance, Corinthian capitals from the temple decorated with human and animal figures, blocks of its architrave with dowel cuttings for an inscription in gilded bronze letters, now missing, hundreds of architectural blocks, fragments of sculpture, and inscriptions from the temple, giving us this remarkable picture of a sanctuary with lavish sculptural ornamentation and the dedications by prominent Sardian citizens and groups. Phil Stinson and Bahadur Yildirim have been putting this temple back together from these fragments, at least on paper. Here you see them giving a seminar at Sardis in 2019 on the temple, demonstrating some of the joins that they found in the sculptured capitals. These pieces were found 250 feet apart and 30 years apart, and the join allows them to be certain that the capital found reused in a later wall belongs to the temple. Baha continued this, finding still more joins, which we can't pin together yet, but which we can hold in place with the help of our commissioner and others. The inscriptions from this sanctuary were published in 2019 by Georg Petzel in his new corpus of all the inscriptions found at Sardis since 1958. And other scholars have quickly used this new corpus to draw new historical conclusions, which to me is one sign of a really successful publication, that it stimulates other people's work. I won't go into that now, but it really is great. What was the structure that had been built out of these inscriptions and architectural fragments? After years of deep excavation, we finally exposed a wall built out of reused architectural fragments and statue bases and inscriptions, which comes to a neat end with a gate And then a road passes through the gate, and the wall continues on the other side of the road. This wall, therefore, seems to be a previously unknown fortification wall that protected central Sardis in the troubled times of the 5th and 6th centuries AD, a major transformation of the city, which is at least, I think, as significant as the temple of the imperial cult. That fortification collapsed in that massive earthquake in the early 7th century that left the blocks stacked like dominoes and crushed one of its inhabitants. The same earthquake split the ground more than 26 feet deep and has been found, as I said, in the rest of the city as well. And unlike the earthquake of 17 AD, which must have been just as damaging, they didn't clean up afterwards, but left the city in ruins. The earthquake also destroyed late Roman houses on top of the terrace, paradoxically preserving them like the houses of Pompeii. We've been excavating one or more large houses with tile floors, painted walls, and rich contents. One pair of rooms was very nicely painted, one room imitating colored marble, the other imitating tapestries, and contained an unusual collection of iron swords, as well as bronze weights, glass vessels, and other equipment. Next to these was a courtyard, which seems to have been in the midst of either renovation or dismantling when the earthquake struck, with column drums and window mullions and a terracotta window screen piled around, awaiting reuse or salvage. The house also seems to have been well supplied with latrines, one in the courtyard, the other just to the north. And samples of these have been examined for parasites by Marissa Ledger, who concludes that the late Romans were surprisingly healthy with relatively few intestinal parasites. And this just came out in the American Journal of Archaeology. When we expanded to the north a couple years ago, the situation was, of course, entirely different. Francis and Jessica Plant and Tyler Walford have been uncovering a series of rooms that are quite different in character. The wall of one room had collapsed, preserving its 3 arched windows, and I had nightmares about what we would find under that wall. Did it collapse onto a dinner party and we'd find their bodies crushed on the floor? Unfortunately not. The floor beneath was completely bare, the area apparently abandoned before the destruction. To the south of this, Tyler uncovered what seems to be one of the very few post-earthquake structures here, a small room built onto the ruins of the former courtyard house. To the west of these is a large marble-paved courtyard with raised platforms which supported basins. Its walls were painted very like one of the rooms to the south, maybe by the same crew even. And you can see here how the earthquake has split and offset that wall by about 3 inches or so. This space too was almost empty of finds without the rich assemblages to the south, and much of the marble had been salvaged after the earthquake. So what's the difference between these two areas? One of them vibrantly occupied at the moment of destruction, the other abandoned. Is this one house, part of which was abandoned for some reason, or are they 2 separate houses, one of which had fallen empty? The discovery in 2019 of a door, which you see in the video on the top there, somewhat rudely cut through the major wall, separating the 2 spaces, suggested that originally these were 2 separate houses which were connected rather late in life, maybe to drain the basin in the northern house out to the south. And then the northern house fell out of use, but much remains to be done. After the earthquake that demolished these buildings, the temple, and also the temple of Artemis and the bath and much of the rest of the city, occupation in the lower town was quite sparse. However, the Acropolis was reoccupied, as I said, and refortified, taking apart the buildings of the lower city and hauling them up the steep cliffs to build a new citadel. These Byzantine fortifications are some of the most visible and strategically important aspect of the site. And the citadel of Sardis has in fact withstood sieges from the Lydian period through the medieval, and even during the Greek invasion of Anatolia after World War I. Sardis was on the border between Greek-occupied Western Anatolia and the Turkish forces of Kemal Ataturk, and the Greeks used the Acropolis as a citadel. Now, for reasons that are probably obvious, looking at the sheer cliffs and precarious walls, a systematic survey of the Byzantine walls and their spolia has never been carried out. The walls are really difficult to survey with conventional instruments. But in 2019, Ben Anderson of Cornell and Jordan Pickett of the University of Georgia began a new survey of the Acropolis using everything from drone photography to detailed archival research of the accounts of early travelers. They spent weeks scrambling and recording the walls and other features, building a database of spolia, and are finally making a long overdue systematic study of this important part of the city. Well, while we focus on the ancient city, we also need to keep it in a broad perspective on the region around Sardis. The city had a really wide territory, marble quarries and villages in the mountains, cemeteries and scattered settlements to the southwest and east, a tumulus cemetery at Bin Tepe, 8 kilometers to the north. We have a couple of projects underway to study the tombs of Sardis. Annetta Alexandridis of Cornell University focusing on the Hellenistic and Roman tombs, while Susanna Ebbinghaus is looking at Lydian tombs, and occasionally we get dragged into unexpected projects. This happened in 2019 when looters uncovered a small Lydian tomb in the mountains about 3 kilometers from Sardis. The local museum at Manisa asked for our help in excavating the tomb, and luckily Susanna Ebbinghaus was right there to oversee the work, one of those serendipitous events, having exactly the right person in the right place at the right time. The tomb is just a simple marble box containing a single skeleton and had been plundered in antiquity, as you can see from the way the bones are scattered. But ancient looters had missed a few things, 5 gold beads and a beautiful gold ring, probably dating to the 5th century BC. And these finds give us a sense of the extraordinary gold work that was available at Sardis at this time. The bones, though, may be more valuable than gold. And we hope that anthropologist Yilmaz Erdal of Hacettepe University and his students will have a chance to study them this summer as part of their ongoing study of ancient Sardians. In 2019, they analyzed the Lydian and Persian skeletons in our depot. And you remember those 8th century BC destruction remains that I mentioned earlier. And when they were excavated, the victims looked as if they'd been sort of unceremoniously thrown into a hole. Yilmaz Bey found that they had also been exposed to air for some time before burial and also gnawed by animals, rather gruesome further evidence for this otherwise unknown sack of the city. The team also analyzed a pair of skeletons that had been dug in 2018 of medieval date. These are also rather ghastly, being, he tells us, an elderly man and a middle-aged woman who were violently murdered and then buried together. The man had suffered 18 wounds, 1 to the leg and then many more to the chest, arms, and hands as he tried to defend himself, while the woman was attacked from behind with a blow to the head, followed by blows to the shoulders and body. But we're not trying just to tell grisly stories, but rather develop a long-term picture of the population at Sardis, how it changed as different groups arrived and controlled the city, how the health and other aspects of the population changed over time. We don't have a really large sample since our focus has been on the city rather than its cemeteries, but as the field of ancient DNA makes such amazing progress, we're working with Dr. Erdal in his new DNA lab in Ankara to learn more about the population of ancient Sardis. A final area of work is at the western part of the city where Professor Hanfmann began. Professor Hanfmann excavated and then restored an enormous bath gymnasium complex with a great colonnaded marble court. In the corner of the bath was a synagogue discovered in 1963 by Professor David Mitten of Harvard, the largest synagogue in the ancient world, paved with 15,000 square feet of mosaics, with walls revetted with colored marble and a colonnaded forecourt. The reconstruction of the bath gymnasium and the synagogue was the first major such reconstruction project undertaken in Turkey, and is still the iconic attraction of Sardis, attracting school children, weddings, and tourists from all over the world. Just a couple years after the restoration was finished in 1974, Andrew and Nancy Ramage discovered that the hill across the street, which we'd always thought was just a hill, was actually the remains of a massive Lydian mud brick and stone fortification that encircled the entire city. 40 years of excavation revealed a wall 65 feet thick and still standing 46 feet high in places. A gate led through this fortification just under the later Roman road and right by the modern Izmir-Ankara highway, or the former Izmir-Ankara highway, I should say. The scale of the fortification is unparalleled outside the great cities of Mesopotamia, and the road stayed there for maybe 3,000 years, from the Lydian period until 2001, when the Turkish Highway Department finally moved the dangerously congested highway to the north outside the ancient site. Our work here focuses on conservation, restoration, and site enhancement to protect these buildings and make them comprehensible to visitors. The biggest elements are two light protective shelters to cover the synagogue and the Lydian fortification, to which I'll return in a moment. But while we were designing and getting permission and fundraising for those structures, we started other smaller projects, stabilizing buildings and making them comprehensible to visitors through limited excavation. The Bath Gymnasium complex and the synagogue are pretty easy to understand now that they've been restored, but the maze of Lydian ruins and that long-lived road are a confusing palimpsest of a millennium of history. So a few years ago, we decided to open a little bit more of the colonnaded avenue right in front of the synagogue. Rather than finding clarity, Genjai Öztürk found a huge pile of marble stones, you see him excavating them here, blocking that highway. And over the next few years, we revealed the remains of a monumental arch collapsed here in place. 33 meters, 100 and something feet wide, and with a central span of more than 12 meters, making it the largest arch in the Roman world. It probably underwent many phases of repair and rebuilding, one of the last of which may have been funded by a local benefactor named Myonius, according to an inscription found nearby. We've now finished excavating the arch, and one of the plans for last summer was to document each block through three-dimensional photogrammetry, and we hope to pull that off this summer. We also knew that the Roman avenue was flanked by porticos and that these were paved with mosaics. Parts had been excavated in the 1960s, but we've always kept them covered with earth and gravel to protect them from tourist traffic. In 2017, though, we cleaned a small area of mosaic near the arch, and to our surprise, the mosaic bore an inscription recording the patron's name. It says that the most magnificent count of consular rank, Flavius Myonius, paved the sidewalk. This must be the same guy who funded the restoration of the arch. We know nothing else about the man, but the mosaics probably date to the late 6th century AD, a period when conventional wisdom has been that the cities of the Eastern Roman Empire were in decline. As at Field 55, then, we see a flowering of urban renewal in this late 6th century, just before calamity. Thanks to a generous grant from the American Embassy in Ankara, a team of conservators, students, and local women cleaned the mosaic, which was a real mess. Many of the tesserae were completely loose, like wiggly teeth, and had to be remortared in place, while others were covered with concretion as hard as a rock, making the original colors invisible. The conservators and assistants worked with brushes and dental tools, and even with a laser donated by laser engineer Ed Teppo. After a couple of years, we had the mosaic cleaned and consolidated in this 2019. But how can we preserve and display it now? We didn't want to rebury it as we reburied the rest of the sidewalk. And in the 1960s, the standard practice was to lift mosaics and reset them in reinforced concrete, but that's no longer okay since it's irreversible and damages the mosaic. That same grant from the American Embassy allowed us to build a glass floor to protect the mosaic, and this was constructed in 2019 with signs explaining the inscription and other remains to visitors. And here you see the floor finished and the conservation team grinning in satisfaction. As I said, in the 1960s, conservation was different. And the restoration of the synagogue was one of the great achievements of Professor Hanfmann's years as director, overseen by the legendary conservator Larry Majewski. Following the best practices of the day, they lifted all the mosaics and reset them in reinforced concrete beddings, and so made this one of the few ancient buildings where you can safely walk on the original mosaic pavements. The experience is unique, but despite the best efforts of 1960s reinforced concrete, the mosaics have begun to deteriorate. Water enters through tiny cracks, causing the iron rebar to rust and expand, which widens the cracks, causes further incursion until finally the mosaics fail. The only way to avoid inevitable destruction is to build a protective shelter roof over the building to keep weather out. So a team of conservators and architects and engineers and archaeologists have been meeting now for more than 10 years to find a solution to these problems. Their design for the synagogue roof was approved by the local council in Izmir, and I'm delighted to say that in 2019, Patrick Healy of Hellman and Friedman in London gave a generous gift that will allow us to construct the roof. We had hoped to do it last summer, but of course the pandemic prevented it. We now intend or hope to construct it this summer. And then we can begin another large project, cleaning and restoring the mosaics with more consistent and more modern materials. Across the street, the Lydian fortification, whose discovery 40 years ago changed our understanding of Lydian Sardis. This has been under temporary roofs ever since it was excavated, so nobody, not even members of the expedition, can normally see this most monumental structure of the period of Alyattes and Croesus. But it was never meant, of course, to be a long-term solution, and we've watched the unbaked structure slowly be damaged by humidity and rising damp. So we planned this project as a double header. First, the relatively easy shelter over the synagogue, and then a second shelter using a consistent architectural vocabulary over the more challenging Lydian fortification. And here too, I'm delighted to announce that a generous bequest from William Kohler will make this possible. William Collins Kohler was one of Professor Hanfmann's students and an important member of the early years of the expedition, and his generous bequest will make possible the protection of this mud brick fortification. The fortification, however, needs more than just a shelter. It needs to be, the mud brick has to be covered to protect it from changes in humidity and weather and bees and other enemies. Our plan is to build a skin of modern mud brick to protect the ancient face, and to test this process, we constructed in 2019 a shell against the wall where it had been cut through already when they built the modern highway, and the bricks all sort of sticking out are meant to indicate that this isn't the face of the wall, but a section through it. This has survived 2 winters successfully, so we're pretty confident now that it's going to work. These 2 roofs will not only protect these important buildings, but also transform visitors' experience of the site, making the synagogue more inviting and less oven-like, and opening the Lydian fortification to visitors. We've worked a lot on signage in this area, but even interested tourists and even archaeologists often walk away puzzled by the palimpsest of thousands of years of continual building and rebuilding, which even we struggle to understand. So to make this part of Sardis more comprehensible, we've been developing an augmented reality app, which will overlay our reconstructions and information on top of a view through your telephone. Our goal, the technology will be familiar to some of you and is getting better every day. Architects Kellyanna Luludis, Zhao Sheng, and others have spent countless hours making 3D models of this site, and these we can make available through this augmented reality program to the general public on their phones, overlaying them on reality to show what the buildings looked like in antiquity. And the version you see, or you're about to see here, is just a couple weeks old. I'm demonstrating it walking around in Vilas Park in Madison, where it had just snowed. Rather than reconstruct the buildings as solid sort of facts, we're making them into ghostly, translucent shapes, which I hope you can see sort of up there in the sky there. This is just a very, very first cut. The architraves, for instance, those bright red things shouldn't be red, they should be ghostly too. That's a mistake, but you get the point. If you were at Sardis, you would see only the reconstruction hovering over the ruins as you walk through them. If you're in home in Madison or Cambridge, you see also the 3-dimensional model of the site. Annotations will explain features or link to our database of finds. It doesn't require a special app, but runs in a web browser and will be, of course, multilingual. So we hope that you'll soon be able to visit Sardis, if not in person, at least virtually. So all this research entails essential responsibilities for publication. Professor Hanfmann established 2 series of Sardis publication, the smaller monographs and the larger reports, and he and Professor Greenwald brought out 3 reports and 12 monographs, an enviable achievement. We're very fortunate in having a superb publication staff to continue Professor Hanfmann's tradition. Carrie Sullivan joined us 2 years ago, bringing with her decades of experience overseeing archaeological publication for the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, and also Columbia, Yale, and other university presses. She joins editor and architect Brianna Bricker, who now works remotely from Cyprus, and together they're an absolute dream team. They redesigned the series in a more modern layout, and we're working with Ege Yayınları in Istanbul, a Turkish press that specializes in archaeological publications, to produce books that would be prohibitively expensive in the United States. Fikret Yegul, for instance, has been studying the temple, as I said, for 30 years, documenting it with careful, large-scale hand drawings of every marble stone. This monograph was in its final stages when the pandemic broke out, but Ege was able to continue working into the summer, and with a little bit of delay, the book appeared last July and is now available from Harvard University Press with a detailed text volume and a separate box of fold-out plans and elevations. At the outset, I mentioned the very first Lydian sectors of Sardis, the House of Bronzes and Pactolus Cliff. Andrew and Nancy Ramage have been responsible for this publication and were joined by Gül Gürtekin Demir in another 2-volume report. Again, despite the pandemic, this was printed this February and is now being shipped to the US for distribution. We had another full season of excavation, conservation, and research planned for 2020, but like everything else in the world, this had to be recalibrated with the pandemic. We were luckily in a pretty good position. Since Sardis was already spread across many institutions on different continents, we put a lot of effort into building networks, databases, and shared file systems and stuff, which are as easily accessible from my attic as they are from the Harvard offices. So our research and publication program could continue, not unchanged, but it could continue from home. The field season was another matter, and a few students who would otherwise have been spending the summer in Turkey took part in a virtual Sardis season, getting useful, if less exciting, experience in research and publication. Among their projects was our recent monographs. We put a lot of effort into printed books, but in fact, if you think about it, only a small number of scholars in the world have access to academic libraries which own those volumes. So for many years, we've distributed PDFs of all our books freely on the website. And when all the libraries closed during the pandemic, this was obviously the right thing to do. And you can download publications as you want. So the students started a new program to convert some of these into ebooks. In addition to being searchable and fully indexed, they include larger color versions of photographs. And although Pipret's plans and reconstruction drawings are lovely on paper, the huge foldouts, I have to say, are a bit unwieldy, especially for those of us now cooped up in very small spaces. So for me, at least, it's nice to have the drawings on a screen where you can zoom in and out rather than in arbitrary sheets. And in this world of increasingly digital scholarship, the skills in making such books will be useful to these students' future careers. They also developed our online database of artifacts, and our goal is to have all of our published sculptures and coins and inscriptions and pottery and other objects available in an online and searchable database. With the help of these students, that is becoming a reality. They wrote essays for the website, such as what it's like to actually excavate at Sardis. You've heard the cleaned up version in this talk, and now you can read what it's really like, from field books to birthday parties. They began a new endeavor, a Sardis section on Google Arts and Culture. They began with essays on Sardis in 20 objects, writing essays explaining the interest and significance of a selection of beautiful objects from the site. This still has to be completed, but I hope to have it available soon. Coordinating this virtual season, as she has for the last 10 years, is Robin Woodman, the expedition coordinator. Robin retired at the end of 2020, and we are very, very grateful to her for her many years of careful planning and oversight. After 62 years of excavation, though, it's hard to hold Sardis down. And as Susanna said, despite the pandemic, in July and August last summer, we were able to hold about a month of limited fieldwork. A staff of 11 people focused on research, documentation, and dissertations, while a field crew finished cleaning the marble court and doing a great deal of other site maintenance. That season went safely and smoothly and was a success from the point of view of conservation research, and also in supporting our crew of local men and women who rely on the summer's work at Sardis each year. So we all hope that life will return to something like normal soon, and that we may have a larger and a safe field season this summer. In the meantime, you can read more about the city and the dig on our website. Thank you, and we hope to see you there in the future.
Thank you, Nick, for this amazing overview. I can't believe we walked all across Sardis without getting any dust on our shoes, and we effortlessly jumped back and forth in 5 millennia, and just an amazing amount of work that happened in the last 2 seasons and even last summer.
Amazing crew who does it.
And so I would like to invite all of you to please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, please type them in, and I will read those out. I think I will start off with a question of myself. I'm always, of course, interested in the beginnings. So I'm so intrigued by the 9th, 8th century remains and the early Bronze Age remains that have come to light. And of course, it's only in very small places. Do you realistically expect that you will find these early remains in other parts of Sardis? And of course, the question is also getting there. Since that
I do, and Guzine, who's put a lot of effort into this, actually went back to the field books and the pottery from Field 49 and identified what she thinks is that same level with big mud brick buildings in 2 other trenches, in Will's Trench and in the trench to the south. When those were excavated, we hadn't realized just how early they are, in part because the pottery isn't very diagnostic, and you have to have a lot of it, and you have to and so that's a hypothesis at the moment. But I do think that we have that level probably fairly widespread. I didn't mention that I think there's a similar building on the next hill over, which has some really interesting pottery from it, and we're studying that too. And I think that's probably about the same date, early 8th century or 9th. So I think there's more to learn. As for the early Bronze Age, that's going to be a tough one, isn't it? But we can try. We can try.
Those are already such deep trenches.
Yeah.
So here we have a number of questions. How have drones changed your work at Sardis?
I always tell this story because Greeny, the previous director, had an item in the budget every year, $5,000 for the helicopter project. And he was going to, he knew somebody in the Air Force who he said, if we would pay the gas, they would provide a helicopter, and we would, for the first time, get these aerial views of the site. It's absolutely transformed our sort of understanding of the site, in part from just an aesthetic point of view. And you've seen how the stills and video let you see things that you wouldn't see on the ground. And then you can do so many other things with these images. So, for instance, the augmented reality app that we're building is going to be built. If you're not at Sardis and so you're not seeing the real thing, you've got to build a virtual model of it, and that's being built largely from drone images. You just slide the drone around, and you take 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 images, and you can stitch them together in the computer into a photogrammetric model, and then that allows you to communicate these buildings, to record them, to study them, and to communicate them with other people. So the drone has really become an amazing tool. It's, you think of it, or at least I think of it now, as as sort of a camera that happens to have wings attached, rather than something else, rather than a drone. And we've got a small fleet of them, actually.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I remember on some excavations in the 90s how we built these constructions with ladders, and just very scary.
We still do that too. And, yeah, or dangling a camera on a long metal pole or something.
There is a practical question here, namely on the publication of the Synagogue, when that is actually going to come out.
We're working very hard on it. We've got a complete manuscript. We're proofreading that now. I could give a year, but I mean, I could give a date, but I'm not sure that but I don't want to. But we're working. That is the absolute next thing on the docket, and it's been it's been a priority for a long time, and Carrie and Brianna are so great at making things happen that I think it's going to come soon.
Certainly, by what's been published this year, we can all be very optimistic. There is a question about labor organization. Can we say anything about the labor and its organization that was involved in building the walls and other structures? And I assume that's kind of other monumental structures.
In probably changes over time. I'll try not to be too snide about this, but in the Lydian period, it seems very disorganized in a way, and it's quite an interesting process. So that you have, say the fortification, which at other sites will be fairly consistent from one stretch to the next, and at Sardis, the fortification changes. We don't see the whole thing at once because you've got to dig these little deep trenches, but every time you dig it, it's clearly the same thing, but the construction is completely different. And I think the best way to one way to understand that is that you do have different crews bringing, for instance, stone and mud brick and other materials in from different sources around Sardis and working in semi-coordination. But it seems, for instance, we've got at least 3 different brick in one section of fortification. We've got different brick dimensions, and I don't want we don't understand the organization as well as we should. Let's put it that way. But it is a very interesting question, and this is one subject of Gesine Arendt's dissertation now, is the organization of labor and the sort of quantification of bringing stone and fill and mud brick and other materials from their sources, which she has traced, many of which she's traced, to this spot, and the labor involved in working those and setting those and so forth and so on. So it's something that we're really interested in.
Thank you. Here is a question. Do you plan to rebuild the monumental arch?
No, that's, I used to bother the architects for estimates of how much of it survives, and it would be 2-3%, maybe 4% or something. It's a very, very, very tiny amount of the arch that survives in terms of volume. And the parts that we do have are so battered that you could, we hope that we'll be able to figure out pretty much every block goes. But many of them, they were deliberately sort of shaved down and broken up after the earthquake to burn them for lime. So they're not in a condition where you could really make anything more of them. And that really is one of the reasons why we're going to this augmented reality thing. And we thought of other things, you could build one of wire, or you could have one of those little blow up things, that waves around at gas stations, or you could think of other ways of doing it. But but the augmented reality is something that people will have now that everybody's got phones.
That makes sense. Here is a question about, oops, no, it's just disappeared. Whether you have any plans to somehow find a way to investigate the spolia that are in the Byzantine fortifications, to look at the inscriptions or the sculpture, the bits of sculpture that might be have been reused there.
It's pretty dangerous to get there. The drone, this is another place where the drone has made it possible to survey these things that we've never been able to get at. You can't, you'd never want to rappel down the sides or anything. But I would, if I can go back here, I will point out, for instance, somewhere, yeah, here, that thing that Van Anderson has his hand on. If you look carefully, that is a human head that had never been noticed in the fortifications. It's perfectly accessible, but they found this. So they are doing a catalog of what is accessible, and studying each block And then we'll have to work from the photographs. They will have to work from the photographs for the stuff that's not accessible. The inscriptions were well studied by Buckler and Robinson between 1910 and 1914 in the first Sardis expedition, and published. And I don't think we've found anything more than they saw. Yeah, but they are working on such a catalog.
We have multiple questions about the Persian destruction of Sardis, and I think I'll give them to you all at once.
Okay.
John Herman asks, was Sardis indeed abandoned after the Persian capture and sack? Because wasn't it actually the base of a satrap? Let's see. Yes, how does the new evidence that Sardis was deurbanized or at least reduced in habitation, how does that actually square with the historical tradition that the site figured prominently in the Ionian Revolt, that the burning of Sardis
that's a
retaliation at Marathon, and then another question from Gretchen Umholtz: do you think the Persian period disassembling and abandonment of the Lydian center was primarily symbolic, or were there practical reasons too?
Well, the question about the Ionian Revolt is actually a really good one, because what Herodotus says is that the Ionians, crossed the Tmolus Mountains, and they descended on Sardis, and they captured it without a fight, except for the Persians who were on the citadel. So the lower city was not fortified, and it says that the houses were made of reeds, and even the houses that were made of mud brick had thatched roofs. And so when a fire started, it quickly swept through the city and burned it down. Now, that's not the picture that we have of Lydian Sardis, is it, with that 20-meter thick fortification? So it might have been harder to take the place, to take the city, if that fortification had still been in use. As for the historical tradition, it's interesting, isn't it? I'm not sure. I don't know exactly what to do with it. Nobody would ever doubt that this was a really, really important place in the Persian period. I would simply say that, archaeologically, everywhere we've dug, and we have put a fair number of holes in Sardis, and we have not found either architectural remains or significant amounts of pottery that would indicate, say, occupation that has been completely removed, to reuse elsewhere, which is always a possibility. And I'm not, I can't say I'm 100% convinced of this. You certainly, anybody can be wrong, and so forth. But nothing we found, we've been looking fairly carefully, nothing we found is incompatible with that interpretation. And we have not found anything that makes us think that there was a city here. So it becomes maybe it becomes, if you think of it more like what Sardis was after the 7th century, it's a very strong place. It's very important in Byzantine history. It's got this fantastic citadel up there. It's got this fantastic citadel where you've got a garrison, and it's a local stronghold, but it's not a city in that same sense. And there was certainly a settlement along the banks of the Pactolus, and Will Bruce wrote his dissertation on this. This was Pactolus North, for instance, and there's a lot of Persian period settlement there, which there isn't in the center of the city. And there's a lot of there's also Persian period settlement and pottery and so forth from Hobbs. So the extramural parts of Sardis continue to be settled, while the intramural part seems to have been abandoned. And I think that is partly maybe a practical matter, because the first thing that the Sardians did after Cyrus captured the place was to revolt, and that's when Cyrus famously asks Croesus, what am I supposed to do with these guys anyway? They're just going to be an endless pain, and should I just kill them all? And Croesus says, no, make them wear soft shoes and make them wear effeminate clothing and teach them to play musical instruments and teach them to be merchants and take away their weapons. And then they will become like women instead of men, and they won't trouble you anymore. And there's lots of things that you can, ways that you can take that. But it does seem to sort of describe what's happening here, that it's a de-urbanization, a de-fortification, a deliberate sort of dispersal of population from a strong, fortified center that could resist Persian authority and has resisted Persian authority to something that's much scattered. And I think this is probably a moment when we know that this is a moment when we find a lot more tumulus tombs in the landscape of Lydia. And those probably belong with estates out in the country. So we've got a different settlement pattern rather than a focused urban settlement. We've got a dispersed sort of rural settlement, which seems to be characteristic of much of the Persian period. And then in the Hellenistic period, we see again a sort of a reurbanization of it. And this is dealt with in that book, Spear One Land, in a number of articles in that.
Yes, thank you. And a complete jump. There's also quite a few questions about the synagogue.
Yeah.
That really shows what a rich site Sardis is. First of all, has the dating of the synagogue been resolved? And also a slightly more practical question, what are the plans for restoring the mosaics in the synagogue?
The date, I think we're coming to, we've got an agreement, I think, in the late 4th century, at the earliest, and what do we mean by the date of the synagogue anyway, right? This is a building that was built over a long period of time, that's restored and damaged and rebuilt and modified and so forth. So it's not like you can put a date on it. But if you mean, which I think you probably do, the time at which this became from public space, part of the bath to, or whatever it was before, to a synagogue, that's going to be probably in the late 4th century, the sort of 3rd or 4th quarter, very broadly. And Andrew Seeger, the author of the book, and Marcus Routman and Jane Evans and various others have all studied this at great length and come up with somewhat different conclusions, but we can all sort of live with something in there, I think. As for restoration of the mosaics, that's something I'm kind of looking forward to, because one of the things that makes those mosaics difficult to understand is the sort of patchwork of different materials that's used to fill in the missing areas. And step forward a little bit. You can see them here. The parts that look like mosaics are the original mosaic, but reset. But then there's a lot of different types of concrete, and different colors, different textures. A lot of that has to be sort of redone in some way, just because parts of it are failing. But also we can do something that's much more sort of aesthetically pleasing, and maybe that ties the patterns in together a little bit more clearly. So that's something we've been consulting with different conservators about, and once we get to that stage, we'll have to make a real plan for it. But it is something I think will make a big difference to the building.
Absolutely. Going straight back to the Bronze Age, how likely is it, you think, that you will find the terrace wall on the east side of Field 49 that supports the early Bronze fill, the early Bronze Age fill?
Boy, that's going to be a tough sell. I think I tried to show that. Where is it? In one of these slides here. And you can see, I don't know, if you can see here the terrace wall, question mark, question mark, question mark. It's at the limit of what we're already doing, and there's of the depth here. We're at 14 meters here. If the hill continues to go down, it's going to be 25 or whatever. It's going to be some very difficult depth, and plus there's a lot of material which I think I tried to show here. There's a lot of there's everything from medieval on. So it would mean dismantling a rather large amount of stuff. It's not impossible, and we'll sort of keep that in mind as we dig more in this area where we got that medieval stuff. One of the things would be to consider these earlier levels too. But it's going to be tough.
What do we know about Lydian urban planning and urbanization from what has been excavated so far?
Not a great deal. Part of the problem is that we spent the first 30 years or more outside the Lydian city. And another problem is that it's so deeply buried, and getting at the stuff on field 49 is actually easy because that's sort of high up where there isn't a lot of alluviation. Once you get to the lower city, it's under meters and meters and meters and meters of fill, stuff that's sort of washed down from above. And that happens, all through history. So it's going to be even more difficult, I think, to get stuff down there. It's certainly not something, it's certainly something that I want to try to learn more about. It's something that particularly interests me. We can talk in general, of course, about the terraces. Let me see if I've got forward to a map here. You can sort of see here in this map here that you've got these different kind of alignments, the sort of yellow alignment here, and that is in fact the alignment of the Lydian terrace on Vis Fort, this terrace here, and then the theater and stadium are on the alignment of the terrace wall here, and then there's another alignment here which aligns pretty well with this a little tiny Lydian house in the theater that I showed. So you're sort of maybe catching echoes of an urban plan, but I think it's, my suspicion is that, oh, and I should have mentioned that the Field 55 terrace here is not a Roman terrace originally. It goes back into the 6th century at least, and the orientation of that terrace seems to have been the same as the Roman terrace. So the Romans are building on, Hellenistic buildings, but building on the same or on an orientation that goes back into the Lydian period. So this is sheer speculation, but if I had to speculate, I would say that a lot of what we see as the urban plan of Hellenistic and Roman Sardis we will be able to trace it back to the Lydian period. And that it seems to be, it seems to be a densely packed city. That's another interesting thing, is that it's not like little bits of habitation from what we see here. It's not little bits of, a little pocket of stuff here and a little pocket of stuff there. We've got dense habitation within the walls here, and we've got habitation in other areas that's, we don't know, obviously, but I think it's going to be a city. It's going to be a city with planning worthy of an imperial capital, where Professor Hanfmann sort of thought of it as, as a palace area on the Acropolis with a rather sort of ragtag bunch of buildings at Pactolus, in Hob and Pactolus North, which don't seem to show a great deal of sort of overall planning. That's my suspicion. I may be totally wrong.
Thank you very much. I think we have 2 more quick questions concerning the Roman period. Is there any opus sectile pavement at Sardis? And also, when exactly was the monumental arch built?
The first one's easy. Yes, we've got very nice opus sectile pavements. Well, very nice, not like Ephesus or something, but we've got a good bit of opus sectile. There's some on Vis Fort, there's some on Field 49, there's various smaller areas. Some of the houses in MMS have opus sectile. And the walls of the synagogue, of course, are opus sectile, beautiful, beautiful opus sectile with figural designs in it. And there's Marcus Rautmann has a great article on the figures of Daniel in the lion's den that must have been somewhere on the walls of the synagogue, for instance, in Opus Sectile, but as walls rather than floor pavement. And as for the date of the arch, that's a good question. And again, it's going to be difficult. I think, my suspicion, I think we can show that it fell down and was put up again at least a couple times. You can see that the blocks have been taken down and relifted. They've got different lifting devices cut into them. So any particular feature of it could belong to one or another of these programs of reconstruction, and pinning down the earliest of them is going to be tough. And we don't have a good date for it yet, I'm afraid.
And what I think will be the last question, looking at the time, are you expecting that you will learn more about the Jewish population of Sardis, such as the size or where exactly the community might have been located?
We certainly hope so. And in recent years at Field 55, for instance, they found a very nice menorah plaque, which is published in Journal of Roman Archaeology. And there's also an incised menorah on the late antique terrace wall there. So there's we're still coming across evidence for Jewish occupation. And, as we work on these late Roman houses and, increase, excavation of that area, we'll just have to see. But it's not the sort of thing that you can really seek out. In a sense, you get what you get. But we have been getting interesting evidence for fairly large scale. That menorah plaque, for instance, is quite an interesting object and well published now. Found unfortunately in a very late context, but still interesting. And what was the other question?
Your answers. I think in your answers you have already laid out another 60+ year program for excavations at Sardis, at least.
We can hope.
There's a lot of praise in the comments. I also would like to thank the Turkish consul in Boston and Harvard's Vice Provost for International Affairs for their supportive comments. And I would like to thank all of you for joining us for this lecture, for listening, for your questions, and also for your support of the archaeological exploration of Sardis. We will follow up with an email with further resources, and generally a great resource is the website of the Archaeological Exploration of Sardis, where you will find many more materials that Nick has referred to in his lecture. You will encounter a quick survey as you leave the Zoom meeting, and we would be very grateful if you could give us feedback. So I would like to end with warm thanks to Nicholas Cahill for an absolutely fabulous lecture. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed for a productive summer season in 2021.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you so much for everything.